I do want to welcome you to the webinar. I'm going to be here to introduce both myself and Chris. We're excited to do this webinar. I will say that this is the first time that it has been given with both Chris and I. It was test ran when I was in Texas because Chris wasn't allowed into our country. But now it is that he is allowed, but now we're doing it in a webinar. So a bit ironic there that now that he's allowed in the country, we're going to do it on the webinar. And before we had to do it in person without him. So I'm excited for it. I'm Mark Hayes. I'm the Director of Business Development for a company called SizeUp. I am sure most of you are familiar with that. We're here to do fatal attraction. Why focusing solely on new business attraction is killing your community and what you should be doing about it. I am joined by my friend, Chris. He is an expert in what he does. He will have a lot of good things to say. So with that being said, Chris, when you're welcome to go ahead and introduce yourself now, if you want to, or you can wait until it's your turn to speak. We're going to kind of bounce back and forth because it gets a little boring listening to the same person speak for 30 minutes at a time. So Chris, you got anything you want to say?
No, just, I think you kick it off. I'll be coming in talking about some statistics. So at least you've got some nice images to kickstart things. And I look forward to, also hearing questions as we go. Please do share them. As many questions as you can is always a good thing.
So without further ado, fatal attraction and economic development. Why focusing solely on business attraction is really not what you should be doing if you're an economic developer. And I will say that when I was kind of kicking this idea around to a friend of mine who's also an economic developer, they said their initial reaction was, well, that's kind of dramatic. And I had to sit back and I'm like, it is kind of dramatic. And I got to thinking about it, but then I remembered, like, okay, let me look up what fatal attraction is. And fatal attraction basically is when you get so obsessed with somebody or something, it puts a something in there that you can't focus on anything else but that thing. So sometimes we, in any of our careers, but especially in economic development, you'll get so focused on bringing in new company that maybe you're not taking time to step back and think about, well, what else could I be doing to do my job better? So for that person that said it's kind of dramatic, it turns out I got kind of lucky that it's exactly to what the webinar is supposed to be speaking on. So let's go to the next slide here. Is a beautiful picture of my little girl. Her name is Layton. She is 5 years old, and her mother, like every other mother on this planet these days, who is a millennial, said, we need a sign in front of each grade every year to tell you what people are into. And I know very good and well that we're the only people who are going to look at this over the course of the next 18 years. But having said that, it was relevant to this conversation because it says right down there in the right corner, when I grow up, I want to be, and she says, scientist. And when she told me that, I was like, that makes perfect sense because I know it's normal for kids, but for her, it's even 1,000 times more. Every single thing that I mentioned to her, she says, well, why? Why this? Why that? Why this? And she is just the most curious kid on the planet. And at times, obviously, that can be a little irritating. And I want to not be my parents who just said because I said so, and they never gave me the answers I'm looking for. But I like to explain to her why things are certain ways. But I feel like as we get older, we kind of are encouraged not to ask why nearly as often. It's just, hey, be quiet. This is what it is. This is what it's supposed to be. And don't ask any questions about it. So this entire webinar, when I was helping put it together, I just wanted the question, why are we doing things a certain way, to be asked? And it reminded me of a story about grandma's pot roast. So there was a young man who was recently married to another young woman, and she said that she had this amazing roast from a secret recipe, because everyone's got a secret recipe, especially when you're in the South, which I am, that her grandmother taught her many years before. And she taught her mom how to do it, who taught her how to do it. So he's like, cool, can't wait to eat this roast. Never been excited about roast before, but here we go. So the young woman, she's starting to prepare and she's putting all the right seasonings. And the man's paying attention. He's like, ooh, those are some good ideas that you're putting on it. And then she does the secret. She cuts off both ends of the roast, just carefully cuts off each end to make the roast just flat on two ends. And he's, well, why are you doing that? And she's like, well, because this is how grandma taught me how to do it. And he's like, yeah, but why? And she's like, well, it lets the flavors get in and different things seep in. And the guy's like, look, I just eat, I don't cook. So I'll take your word for it. Well, fast forward down the line, this is always how the roast gets made. So one day, a holiday comes along and grandma's actually going to come and she's going to make the roast herself. So he's excited. I'm going to get it directly from the person who created this recipe. And he's watching, and it's like, okay, I see the seasoning you're using. I see the technique. And the young woman's in there as well. But then grandma puts the whole roast into the pot, and she puts it into the oven to start cooking. And the young woman says, "Grandma, you're doing it wrong." And grandma looks at her kind of puzzled, and she says, "What do you mean I'm doing it wrong? Like, I've been doing this since long before you were thought about, before your mother was even thought about." And she said, no. You didn't cut the ends off of the roast like mom had taught me how to do. And grandma scratches her head, and she's like, "Why would you cut the ends off the roast? All the juice is going to leak out." And she's like, "Well, that's how you've always done it." She said, "No, ever since I could afford a pan that was bigger than the size of the roast, I stopped having to cut off the ends of the roast." So it just goes to show you, she was doing that out of necessity. And then further generations just started doing it because that's how their predecessor did it. And in economic development, I have seen economic development get done the same way for a very long time. There are flyers from the early 1900s that are just showing off a community. Be aware that maybe the reason you're doing it the way you're doing it is just because it's always been done that way. So that is grandma's roast, and that is my inquisitive 5-year-old who's just going to teach you to question a little more things. So if we could raise our hands, I would ask you right now, like a show of hands, who within their job description is adding jobs going to be one of the things that they need to do? And every single hand in this room would go up. Adding jobs is an important part. Yeah, somebody raised their hand. I forgot you could do that on Zoom. But yeah, you want to add jobs, right? So we should be asking the question like, okay, if adding jobs is what economic development is that what it should be? And I actually started looking up definitions of economic development. And I will tell you, there is not like a given, this is the answer to what economic development is. But for a lot of people, they were like, it's job creation in caps. Job creation, that's what economic development is. So I started to look, well, what are a little bit better definitions of economic development? And I found one, this is actually from CALED, the California Association of Economic Development, or whatever it stands for, but the creation of wealth from which community benefits are realized. It is more than a jobs program. It's an investment in growing your economy and enhancing the prosperity and quality of life for all italicized residents. I think that's a beautiful definition of economic development. And I feel like if we all did our job with that as the goal, we would see jobs get created, but we would just see better qualities of life for everyone in the community. But if we're only going to talk about jobs, then I do create all my own slides, by the way. See my nice art here. Mark, where do jobs come from? Well, let's talk about it. I believe that there are 3 places that jobs come from. So if we look at it as a stool, you need each one of these legs to successfully create 100% of jobs per se. So it comes from business attraction, business retention and expansion, and entrepreneurship. We're going to talk about all 3 of those legs. Luckily, I do not have to talk about business attraction because I have a guy with me in Chris Knight who knows a whole lot more about it. So leg 1 of the 3 things of creating jobs to 100% is business attraction. And I will pass that along to you, Chris.
Thanks.
I just my share and you can start yours. Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so my name Chris Knight. Hold on, just enable media. Should be able to see my screen. So who are we? So at WAVTEQ, we're really doing the business attraction work for governments everywhere in the world. So we've got our ear to the ground. We understand the importance of business attraction and how it's changed throughout the pandemic. But how we're going to begin is really taking a look at some real up-to-date data about the real opportunity which exists in terms of business attraction. So what this is showing, and now these slides I'm about to show, this is from UNCTAD, who have just released their new projections, and it's pretty positive news. You know, FDI has rebounded far faster than anyone expected. In fact, it's expected to hit a level of the pre-pandemic level of $1 trillion in FDI flows by the end of this year. If we looked maybe around June of this year, the prediction was that we would not hit the trillion again until next year. So FDI has started to rebound. But this is FDI flows. So remember, there is differences when we look at FDI. You've got your greenfield FDI, which is typically the job creation, the old school FDI that all economic developers are attracting. You then have mergers and acquisitions, portfolio investment. So the FDI flows is counting all of that. So there are a few caveats with this. You know, it's not all good news. I think the most pressing one and maybe concerning one is the FDI recovery It's not going to be, uniform. It's going to be uneven. And it's going to be developing economies who are going to benefit from this initially, this bounce back, who are going to drive this growth of FDI, really because of M&A. There's been a huge amount of M&A which has been happening over the past 6 months. Then also with higher vaccine levels, it's also going to help facilitate the economic recovery. So this is just showing you overall where we are and how it's looking now moving towards the end of the year. But I will be touching as well within this on forecasts. We'll break it down by sectors, by which regions are source markets. So you can start thinking, because, a lot of people's business attraction has completely changed over the past year. We've been doing far too many webinars. We've been doing, cold calls, more digital media expenditure. We haven't been out traveling, meeting investors like we have before. And even though this is coming back, not all countries are coming back at the same time. So I'm based here in the UK, and now we've lots of EDOs coming over to meet with the companies again. But yet my office in Japan, you still can't travel there. So maybe your traditional markets have been China, Japan, Korea, and you're having to reevaluate where to look. So this will give some ideas as we go through. Again, UNCTAD going into what they're looking at in the first half of this year, 74% growth in FDI compared to the second half of 2020. So it shows that we are on the right path to growth, and it's good. You'll be seeing more leads. I can even think off the top of my head, we've landed 3 successes for clients in the past 2 months. So these projects which you've been, stalling, talking to, they are coming through. When we look at this, nearly 300 million increase in FDI has been within developed economies. Huge amount in the US has been M&A. Over 90% of the FDI, if you look at capital amount, has been within mergers and acquisition. If you look at emerging economies, it's mostly within infrastructure. And a lot of these projects, we're working in a lot of developing economies, and they're coming up with, they call them IPROs, investment projects ready to offer. And that's a way to kickstart infrastructure projects. So you'll have like maybe a whole list of projects which can be invested. You'll go out to investors with these possible opportunities and they can invest cash. So rather than greenfield. So that's been growing a lot. But where has the FDI gone to? And it's no surprise that the largest economies are attracting the most FDI. It's always been the same as this, right? So nothing's different. You've got, the growth, particularly within China, the US, and the UK. They've all been pretty strong rebounding. India, they got their hit by COVID much later than the rest, and then their second wave then happened. So it's at a different lag than some of the other markets. So then looking at where FDI goes out of, so over half of all FDI goes from the G20 countries. So it's nearly all the growth. You can see total growth from 279 to 844, but yet in these G20 from OECD, it's already showing the majority of that growth. So we'll not go too much into that. Source markets, where does it come from? Again, dominated by the US, by Japan, Germany. The reason these ones are so high is, US, Japan, Germany, and China, they're the largest. Their sectors are all capital intensive, so a lot of manufacturing, whereas places like the UK tends to be more projects, but they're much smaller. You can see here a large decline from the Netherlands and Ireland. This is due to divestments driven by the change in the US corporate tax. So subsidiaries in these countries were paying back their loans from their headquarters in the US. So the FDI reversed. But here, I think, it's worth looking at source markets. Look, 8 of these markets are from Asia. So there's going to be an opportunity. So I cut out a few of them. There were more from Asia. But if we go down to the greenfield FDI, and this is, typically what the majority of EDOs are really focused on. Some of you will be on M&A, but for this, we're going to take a look at just greenfield. And this is where we're expecting it to go. And this is, using our own internal forecasting model by looking at which sectors are growing, the speed in which they're growing compared to the economies and how they're opening. And we can see, to get us back to the level of 2019, it's going to be by around 2024 in terms of greenfield investment. But it is going to grow rapidly each year by around 10%. In terms of what sectors, so this is just looking at a split in terms of pre versus post and during the pandemic. So what has been resilient? Because you'll have your resilient sectors, then we'll go into growth sectors. The resilient ones are things like communications. So we all seen the price of Zoom increase. Consumer products, more people were working at home. They're buying different products during, I guess, lockdowns. Medical devices were growing. Wet transportation, particularly, with e-commerce growing, people were setting up more warehousing around the world. Food and beverages, because there was a shortage traveling around the world, so people wanted to be within countries to grow that. And you can see what was declining, which we've seen in the news: hotels, automotive, chemicals, the traditional sectors which weren't able to continue growing. But if we look at a forecast, where do we see, in our opinion, and again, a lot of this is coming from the leads we're finding, the companies we're speaking to, the economic development organizations, it's going to be within semiconductors, engines, automotive, electric vehicles, renewable energy. We've seen COP was just finished, so there's going to be a lot within this. And what's driving it? Well, it's the industry transformation. It's reshoring, which I know a lot of you have been focusing on, and climate change, and moving much more digital, which again, we'll be touching upon in this presentation. Good news for the majority of folks on this call is that the top destinations, and we've done 2019 to 2020 to forecasting 2025. And we can see here, the huge growth expected within the US. As well as China. But there's also a lot of growth going to be in various emerging markets. So we've got India, Vietnam, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, all going to have a lot of growth in terms of attracting FDI. Looking alone at where we think projects and jobs are going to come, we've broken it up now by you see the line number of projects to North America each year, then broken that down by how many jobs we think will be created in the US versus Canada. So again, we can see each year this is going to bounce, and there is a lot of pent up demand for companies wanting to go to the US. Good examples are, I speak to our companies in Japan and Korea. And a lot of these companies are wanting to expand to the US. They're just waiting for that time when they can start traveling and move it to the next stage. So, the next 6 months to a year, I think there's going to be a massive ramp up in companies investing within the US. In terms of, where to focus, and this is usually the same, pretty similar. The big 6 countries, that is half of the world's FDI. So if you look at you can nearly link it to GDP, which countries you should be focusing on. But taking a look at some of the ones which are going to rebound a lot, you look at Korea, it's going to be a big opportunity. It's going to grow, as is Taiwan. So there are a few countries which maybe you haven't focused on in the past, and it would be worth taking a look at these moving forward over the next few years. So what we decided to do is we looked at, and this wasn't from us, we looked at a poll which was done in terms speaking to C-level executives to see, what is impacting long-term FDI. And the number one thing, and we're hearing this nonstop, is climate change. This was at top of the list with many executives. Next, we have remote working, which we'll talk about further in this, but executives are thinking about this, and it'd be interesting to know how many folks on this call are working remotely. We then move into Industry 4.0, moving within this and seeing how manufacturing is going to change. This is another big trend, with the last one being offshoring or nearshoring is turning out to be another large trend we're seeing. But we then looked at, from several things. So we work using FDI Markets database as well as our own corporate intelligence unit to take a look at leads, signals, and companies which are looking to go overseas. And we started tracking it, where those companies are headquartered. So you can see there is a growth of signals coming out of Western Europe and North America. Asia has a little decline at the minute, but again, we expect that to ramp up next year, and there'll be a lot more leads from Asia. So the final thing, I guess, is looking at some of the top growth sectors. So we split this up, and this is from our corporate intelligence unit. So we've actually found recently, we're doing a lot more work for economic development organizations going down to subsector level. Traditionally, folks were looking at financial services, renewable energy, business services, ICT, but now everyone's going that bit further. And we're winning a lot of projects of redefining value propositions to go into this granularity, because this is what investors expect. So some of the high growth industries we see, and you've got electric vehicles, renewable energy, robotics, and then you've got things, technology disruption within fintech, within edtech. A good example, I work in the Caribbean, and they're finding now that a lot of students can work virtually, that some of their talent is not going to universities in the United States. So they're keeping some of the diaspora on the islands, which is helping to create more startups. And then you've got the high growth software style. So your artificial intelligence, your gaming, cybersecurity. These are where we're seeing a huge amount of growth. And another thing that a lot of these have in common is they've been able to continue growing and relocating and setting up overseas during the pandemic, because it's not, heavy manufacturing where they have to look at 10 different sites where, they have to go and visit. A lot of these can continue and they can set up remotely. So with that, I'm just going to stop and pass it back to Mark. We can't hear you, Mark.
Yeah, Chris, if you keep yourself not muted, before I start back, I kind of want to do it more podcast style, just as I'm listening to what you have to say. If I were an economic developer that had a strategy that was developed before 2018, basically what you're telling me is it might be already time to re-strategize. Like, don't wait till the end of your 5-year strategy or your 10-year strategy. If there are certain sectors you thought you should go after based on what you are seeing globally, maybe that's not what you should be doing. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. And I've actually said to EDOs, and I've never said it in an open space, so I'm going to say it.
Be careful.
If you had your strategy in 2019, you probably need to shelve that for a few years, because we're in a bumpy road, and I think you need to be pretty fluid with what you're doing. You need to go where the opportunities are. You need to redefine these sectors. I'm not saying to change your full strategy, but the components of how to do your business attraction and how to do your investor outreach and which markets, and also how to market your location, they have all had to change. You're not doing trade shows now. You're not flying out to do company visits. So you do need to kind of rip up a few pages and redo it. And that's what we're seeing now, is that we're now coming out the back end of it, and people have decided, actually, I do need to redefine my propositions. We can get a bit more detail based on the inquiries we're receiving.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I never really had the data to back that up, right? Until I hear what you're having to say and see what you're saying. But I've heard economic developers say as recently as a month ago at IEDC, oh, we were just told to stay the course. And I thought to myself, like, a landslide just took out the road. Like, why would you stay the course? Like, no private business stayed the course during the COVID-19 pandemic. So why would our industry be special? So I completely agree. It's like, though you shouldn't lose sight of everything you've always had goals about, the world changed. Why wouldn't you?
The overall goals will be the same, right? Job creation,
yeah.
Employment, all of those goals will remain the same, but the way to get there is going to be slightly different.
Fantastic. And I also took from you what you had to say, like there are less projects to be had. So, cold calling is going to be less successful than it was in 2018. It's going to be less successful than it was in 2017. Having some help in doing that obviously would be beneficial. And you know that no more so than anybody else.
We're finding, and I know you'll touch upon it, but data is king. What we're doing is no longer, we don't have the resources. We do not have a telesales operation. So we're not going to be calling. What we're going to be doing is identifying companies with the potential to grow and a reason to grow and why your location is a good fit for them. So you nearly need to start matching this up and not pretending, that you're the best location for all sectors. That's why people are defining what their key value propositions are within subsectors, identifying who those companies are and going out to them with a conversation and an opportunity for them. And I think you've got a better, target there. You've got, a better shot selection. You're going to get more people responsive to you because they know your location. They know you want to talk about something which is beneficial to them.
Fantastic stuff. Like I said, I wanted to do this different than most webinars. So I had questions on my mind right now. I asked them. I encourage everybody else, since me and Chris are switching back and forth, you can actually be asking questions. We're not going to look at all of them right now because we want to get through the slides. We are going to share, Phyllis, you asked about, can you share slides? We are going to share these slides and the presentation afterwards. Chris's slides are really complex and they're not just words written over words. So I know you want to look at them longer. We're going to make sure you have that opportunity. So yes, thank you for asking that. Back to the presentation now. And we're going to talk about, we've only talked about one of these three legs, I just hit from the beginning because I wasn't paying attention. And that's what happens when you don't pay attention. But we will talk about the next thing, which is, so we talked about one of three, right? Business attraction. That's what I would say most people on this call know they kind of focus on from time to time, and they should be doing. But we need to be talking about these other legs and what others are doing and why they're important. So next, I'm going to talk about entrepreneurship. This is a space that I've been in for a very long time, whether it was working with individual businesses or working in economic development, helping individual businesses. So entrepreneurship. What if I told you that if you only focused on entrepreneurship from 1993 on, that you would have created more than 425% of new jobs than somebody who only focused on big business attraction? I know that would surprise very many people on this call because you've been told throughout your career that you're creating jobs through attracting 500, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 person businesses to create these jobs. But no, I don't care what community you're in on this call. Most of your jobs are coming from small businesses. So they're coming from your entrepreneurs. If you want to create jobs, you have to be helping small businesses. It is a more important leg than bringing in large businesses. So there are definitely people who are on this call who are saying, well, what is a large business? And that's a fantastic question. You're very smart. You should be asking that question. And the SBA defines a small business as 499 or less employees. So now you just said, ha, got him, because I asked that question. And I'm like, fair enough. But I prepared for that because I got curious as well. So if we lowered that threshold to 250 employees or less, you would still have almost 350% more jobs being created by those businesses than by the ones larger than that. That's still a gigantic number. But there's somebody from a small community on this webinar who says, if I have a 200-person business, that's the biggest business in my community. So if we lowered that threshold to 99 employees or less, they would still create over 230% more jobs in that same exact time frame than what the businesses larger than that created. So then just 100 and more what they created. So when you're talking about jobs and where they're created from, it's from the smallest of small businesses, not just what's defined by the SBA as 499 or less. You have to be focusing on small businesses. The data is going to suggest it no matter where you look. So now let's talk about recent though, right? So we talked about that time period and what was happening in terms of job creation. Well, we know, or most of us suspect, that in 2020 and 2021, Chris just showed a bunch of slides that big businesses and what they decided to expand to, where they, big businesses were going, and FDI, it definitely slid a lot. And I don't have to tell you guys that, you experienced it. So you would think same thing happened with entrepreneurs, right? Like, who was crazy enough to start a small business during a pandemic? And the answer to that is more people than in the history of ever in 2020. They started more businesses in those quarters, in quarters 3 and then quarter 4 and then going into quarter 1 of 2021 than in quarter 1 of the year before, which quarter 1, as you can see, is always the highest amount of job creation or of entrepreneurs starting businesses. So more people were starting in the quarters when usually it's the least than before then. That's a huge deal. So what about in 2021? The trend continued. Even more people decided to start businesses. So you are seeing businesses start at a rate that's literally never been seen before, as you can see on this chart. That's hundreds of thousands of businesses that people are saying, you know what? I have the courage now. I'm going to start my business. I'm going to take control of my own destiny. Those businesses need help, and they need to have resources to have the encouragement to start in your community. So if we look at this just a little differently, I like to present data in many different ways. You can see kind of what I was talking about. Like, okay, in the first half of the year, it's always more business starts than in the second half of the year. And you see that little jigsaw all the way through. It never changes. So in the second half of 2020, you would say, okay, it's going to be lower than the first half. Absolutely not. For the first time ever, there was just this explosion of second half businesses during 2020. And then in 2021, even more in the first half of this year, of 2021. Obviously, we're in the second half this year. We'll see how this plays out. But you can see that there's a trend towards more businesses starting than have ever started before. How can we not be helping those businesses? They're a huge job creator right now. So there's an entrepreneurship boom that has never happened before. It's a once in a career opportunity. So what should you be doing about it? How should you be helping these businesses? In terms of jobs, how do we make sure that jobs are created and really maximized through this? Well, first we get to talk about Ed Helms here, that you're in the good old days. If you're not doing this, you're one day going to look back and say, man, if I would have focused on entrepreneurship during that window of time, during those 2, 3, 4 years, I could have built a community that was a lot better than what I currently have it, that has a lot more small businesses, that has a prosperous small business community that, as we'll show going forward, is going to make it more attractive for the larger businesses who you've been going after to want to be in your community. There's a real opportunity that you have to grab hold of now. So the problem with small businesses, they're really good at what they do. They are chefs, or they are woodworkers, or software engineers, or they're dentists, or they're making clothes, but they're bad at business. Well, who works with business all the time? And you guys, largely with big businesses, could you provide the same expertise to the small businesses? And what you could do to directly correlate to creating jobs would be to reduce the small business failure rate. So what is the small business failure rate? Well, most people on this call are going to be 50% of businesses fail, of small businesses fail. And you are correct when you say that, but it's not as bad as some people think, which is 50% of first-year businesses fail. But it's also not as good as some of you think, in that, like, at some given point in time, 50% of small businesses fail. No, what the data is that in the first 5 years, 50% of small businesses are going to fail within that window of the first year they start to the 5th year they start. Half of them aren't going to make it work. But the caveat there is 20% of those businesses, and I'm talking about a lot of numbers here, so just kind of bear with me, 20% of that 50% fail in year 1. So we just talked about an awful lot of businesses who are in year 1 of their business. This is the crucial time of their business. It is when they are most likely to fail. They need assistance, and they need assistance right now, not in the future, not in year 2 or year 3, which they need it in those years, but they need it right now, because there's a natural fail rate, as you can see, years 2, 3, 4, and 5, that's a total of 30%, right? So year 1's 20%, 5 years is 50%. So years 2, 3, 4, and 5, that 30%, it breaks down to the rest of the fail rate. So you get, if you look at these numbers, some people are numbers folks and they're following, some aren't, but you can look at the slide after, there's about a 7.5% natural death rate. So in the 20% that are failing in year 1, just to be very, if you just said 7.5% are going to fail no matter what, which I think is way too high, but it's a conservative number when using math, just 7.5% are going to fail no matter what. Well, that remaining 62% in there, 12.5% of businesses in the total, but 62% of those failed businesses fail because of lack of preparation. They had a lack of access to information. That is something that you guys work with every day when you're helping a business choose your community. You're giving them more information than they could ever hope for. Small businesses don't have access to that information. So that's what you can do. And you can't wait to do it. You have to do it right now. Some would even argue that it is urgent that you do it right now. So I hope you guys can hear the audio right now. Urgent, urgent, emergency. Anyway, it is urgent that you help these small businesses right now. So if you remember anything else, know that there's a bunch of businesses that started this year that need urgent help right now. You should be looking into ways to help them. So Mark, what are the ways to help them? Well, incubators and accelerators, they're fantastic. They help small entrepreneurs grow into bigger businesses. The problem with those things, well, there's a couple problems. One, they take a while to start. So if you haven't started one, you can't be like, hey, to help these first year businesses, I'm going to have an incubator. They will be in their fourth year by the time you get that thing open. But the second problem with them is they're selective. So only, 25 in some of them, or 50 businesses or 100 businesses in a giant incubator can be using all of those resources at the same time. Well, what about the other 1,000 businesses that are starting, or 10,000 businesses that are starting? How do they get help? And the answer to that is software solutions. We live in an era where the computer can help people do things, and they can help an infinite amount of people do things right now. So you have to use software. And sometimes during these, I'm reluctant to talk about what it is I do, but it's almost unfair because we offer a fantastic solution to helping these businesses through software in SizeUp. And this slide just pointing out, it's not just for the big cities. Some smaller cities are like, well, of course you can help Dallas. Yeah, we do help Dallas, and we help Pasadena, and we help little 18,000 person Buda. We help Conroe. So whether you're a 5,000 person community or a 5 million person community, this software can help the businesses in your community. It can be relevant to you. If you've never heard about SizeUp before, I want to share that information with you because there's not a better solution to help entrepreneurs when they're starting a business, trying to get information and market research to help them. But it's simple to use. The software you offer them, you can't say, oh, we have data software on our website or whatever the case may be, because is it easy to use? It needs to be so easy that a caveman can do it. Hopefully no Geico representatives are on here because I did not get permission to use that, but it needs to be simple. And I'm not going to talk but for another 30 seconds about SizeUp, but I just want to point out, if you've never seen it before, it's going to give you access to market research. So if I'm a coffee shop in Buda, Texas, how do I compare to other coffee shops in Buda, Texas? What should I expect to make in revenue? How many employees should I expect to try to hire? It's a tight labor market right now. What should I expect to pay them to remain competitive in my industry specifically? Revenues per capita. Let me compare myself where it is reasonable to expect to achieve and where it's not, to make sure I'm making smart decisions from there. Where are my customers located at? What's their contact information? Hey, I'm going to need supplies. It's hard to find supplies right now. Where within the region, within the state, are there suppliers I could be using and finding and getting the best prices and the product that I need? Where are the best places to locate or advertise? And you see, it's just little red dots saying, go here. You do not have to do any analysis here. This is where, based on your industry and an underserved market in your city, where it's going to make the most sense for you to spend that advertising budget to find those customers, and where specifically are the neighborhoods that the densest population of customers are located. So you're going to get information that you need, and you're going to get it right now. These businesses need your help. Entrepreneurship's a huge job creator, and it's a bigger job creator now than it's ever been, and it's much bigger than anything else right now. You have to be focusing on that, not solely focusing on that, but you can't just say, well, we don't do that. Because somebody needs to be doing it. So that is entrepreneurship. Now the third and final leg, I'm going to talk a little bit about BR&E. Chris, I'm sure will have stuff to chime in about, but business retention and expansion. I would say that most people do some form of business retention and expansion, but what does your business retention and expansion program look like? And is that what it should look like to maximize what's coming out of it? Does size matter in your business retention and expansion? So I mean, a lot of folks, how they do it is, what are our biggest employers in our community and how can we help those employers? And let's call them and let's do surveys and let's figure out how we make sure that those employers both remain in business and that maybe they grow in size. And I would question, is that the right way to be doing business retention and expansion? And I have some data suggesting it's not. But this is one thing that I want you to think about. Do those businesses really need your help? And I don't mean to dismiss what it is that you guys do, because you do important stuff, but does a giant, does Ford Motor Company need the help of the Economic Development Organization? Once they've already located in your community, do they really need your help if they need data or need research or need anything? Well, no, they have access to all their own people. They partner with KPMG or Deloitte or somebody. So I don't think they necessarily need the things that you're talking about. Secondly, I talked to an economic developer in Florida, is a real life economic developer. And I asked them point blank, like, when you meet with these people, what comes out of it? And he said, I don't even really bother doing my BR&E with the biggest businesses unless it's real estate decisions. So if they have outgrown their space, they need new space, let's make sure we find another location for them, or that we figure out how to expand on the current location so that we don't lose this business to another community. So certainly there is some of your expertise needed there, but they really need you on a day-to-day to be helping them grow their businesses. I would argue probably not. So I was looking around at good examples of business retention and expansion programs, and I found this guy. You may not recognize him, so let's just listen to what he has to say.
Large companies tend to get a lot of attention. What's ironic is the reality is that we know from research that small businesses are the major drivers of job growth, not only in Indiana, but nationally. In Indiana right now, roughly 85% of all businesses that exist in our state employ less than 100 people. And they are the ones who are really most likely to add new jobs to their portfolio. So they really are the growth machine in the state. But we oftentimes overlook them because we're trying to get that big company to come to Indiana. And so, unfortunately, what we're trying to do is help educate local decision makers, local economic development groups about the importance and value that small businesses play to the economic health of our state.
So who this guy is he's just a professor at Purdue University. And he realized, hold on, let me get out of that. We're not going to listen to the whole video, but I just wanted to point out that this is not a traditional economic developer. It is somebody who does data and pays attention to data, and said, you know what? We've noticed that there's not the help from economic development to the groups of people that the data is suggesting need the help the most, to the groups of people that are creating the most jobs. He said that if you are going to focus on business retention and expansion, then you need to be focusing on the businesses between 10 and 99 employees, because those are the highest growth rate businesses. So this just goes further to prove that this is somebody who's not biased at all. He just noticed these businesses weren't being helped in Indiana like they should be, because the data would suggest this is where the majority of new jobs are coming from when you're talking about expanding businesses, not from those biggest businesses in your community. It's something you should be thinking about. So some of you are saying, well, that sounds a lot like economic gardening. And I completely agree. It is. That is exactly what economic gardening focuses on. You can see that with their data, 80% of more jobs are created locally in every state. So the small businesses are who create the most jobs in every single state in the country, no matter who you're talking about. But 15% of all companies are between 10 and 100 employees, yet 40% of jobs are created by those companies. So it's not that many businesses, but it's 40% of the jobs being created. If that data alone doesn't convince you, I need to be helping the smaller businesses in my BR&E efforts, I don't think there's anything that will. And then this is just a little more about economic gardening. I think it's interesting. They started in Littleton, Colorado in a 20-year period of time. So it was a long experiment. They focused nothing, not a single incentive, not a single amount of time spent on recruiting companies, but instead just focused on helping smaller businesses in that 10 to 100 employee range grow. And they doubled their amount of jobs in their community in that period of time, just working on that. It's something worth thinking about. You should be focusing on business retention expansion, but you should be focusing on the right size businesses. Lastly, this is driving that point home forward. So the Kauffman Foundation, they showed you here, companies more than 5 years old destroyed more jobs than created in all but 8 years here. So in other words, 100% of the job creation basically was coming from companies less than 5 years old. So your BR&E efforts, if you are trying to grow these companies that have been around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, those aren't the likely ones who are going to grow. On a national scale, it's less than 5 years old who are the most likely to grow. So what are your priorities? Where are you going to put your time in BR&E, and how are you going to do it? It's going to be difficult to touch every single business in your community that's, an entrepreneur or from 10 to 99 employees. Definitely, you need to make sure software solutions are helping partner with other groups of people. So having said that, I'm going to pass it now back over to Chris, and we're going to talk about workforce. We talked about jobs. There's a lot of places it's coming from. You need to focus on all those areas. And now, Chris, you can talk a bit about workforce, and then I'm going to share some data about workforce.
Yeah, I just to jump in on the BRE, because I I agree to a huge point, that people often forget about the SMEs, about adding them to their BRE strategy. But I do think it is also imperative that they focus on the major companies as well. So my point is, you said they're not going to create the jobs. Again, I agree. But from what we've been working on, what they do is they embed in the community. They bring along their supply chains, and they help upskill a lot of what's going on in the community. And actually, the bigger issue is if they leave, not grow, because you've got a huge job deficit if they go, as well as taxes. So my thought and what we recommend, actually, all companies get a BRE attention, right? And different ones have different needs. So the larger companies absolutely agree they need no data. They've got it all in-house. In fact, they've got better data than anyone in this call has got, because they've probably got more money. But then you've got the small companies are the ones that need your help on data, and that it's going to be absolutely key. So, with the bigger companies, it's probably more about relationship building. It's more about networking, putting them in to meet the right people, to get involved with the universities, the research institutions. So having a kind of dual BRE strategy, I think, is what would really benefit all economic development organizations. But agree with Mark that too many focus solely on the larger companies. But I'm going to talk about something which, it's going to take it probably to the next level of thinking about BRE, and that's this new sensation, I guess, of remote working. So I'm just going to share my screen, and this is something which we've been moving much more into, and we're helping the likes of Scotland and a few other governments take a look at really workforce and being remote and attracting talent rather than businesses. And I mentioned before, it was the second most important location factor when we looked earlier. And many surveys often say about the importance of workforce. The pandemic has meant it's accelerated the number of people who are working at home, and what the traditional investment model is. We're a small company, we've got 62 members of staff, and what we did was what a lot of companies are doing. We decided we don't need a big office to house 30 people, so we now have a small office for about 6 people, and teams go in at different shifts. And this is something economic developers are going to need to think of in terms of what the offering is, how the new work pattern is. Are people going to have to be in cities or further out? But we're starting to see, governments are wanting to attract talent. And I was working for a Canadian location, and we were doing their UK lead generation. And we spoke to a company, and the company, usually when you speak to a company, they're asking about properties available, like what's available in location X. The company did not care. They wanted, instead of a list of properties, they wanted a list of people and talent. That is how companies are now thinking. And, if you look at it, it's going to get more important. I shared earlier on some of the key sectors which are growing. Nearly 30% of global FDI in the first 8 months are in sectors which can do remote working. That's nearly a third of all jobs can be remote so far this year. We did a survey, we did a webinar with a lot of economic developers, and 70% of EDOs see the trend of remote working to be positive. Again, I can share more with you. The words we're getting quite often now when we're speaking to investors are, are they looking at physical, virtual, or quite often it's a hybrid? This is what people are looking at. And you started to see it, if you look at Future of Workforce Pulse, they say by 2035, 36 million Americans will work remotely. And people are getting involved in it. If you take a look at Tulsa in Oklahoma, they're trying to get people to their location by offering grants of up to 10,000. Topeka, again, giving grants. Iceland, they're offering long-term visas. You have to earn $8,000 a month, but you're able to stay in Iceland. Dubai, they told me that they've got long-term visa for digital nomads, and they get 300 applicants a week, showing you how much talent they're able to attract. And that is so important. Now, businesses will also, I think there'll be a huge influx of business to Dubai because there is talent. Other locations are doing things. But what this shows, we've also got a database which looks at incentives handed out. The average incentive in the US is $22,875 per job. That is double the incentives that these locations are giving to attract mobile workers. So it is worth thinking about what the incentives should be going on moving down the line. Here's an example of, so I'm from Northern Ireland, and this is an example of a client we're working with. So HGS, so they went to Northern Ireland, they created 560 jobs, every one of them being virtual. Okay, so with this, they also are looking at the environmental benefits. So climate change comes into play because people aren't having to travel to work. People have better work-life balance. They got given an incentive to do this. And it was all because of the availability of talent. They didn't have to be within any city. They looked at the whole country and said, well, we don't mind where our staff are. So the CEO of the EDO basically said it helps contribute to a balanced spread of economic development. Again, because usually, sometimes the more rural locations, there are not the same type of jobs. And in Northern Ireland, outside of London, Derry and Belfast, you typically don't have the same type of jobs available, but this is now offering 560 jobs across the country. So again, our survey, I said, we asked people about their perspectives. 70% seen it as a positive development. 20% said their organizations had already received inquiries for remote workers. And 35%, they don't think it will reduce the number of physical investments. Interesting, we always talk about sectors. So I thought this, again, we'll send this to you because I know we're running out of time, but the potential share of time, sectors where you can work remotely. So the gray button shows work that can be done remotely without any loss of productivity. And the blue is where it can be done remotely, but clear benefits are from doing it in person. So if you're looking at a lot of the service sector and software, it can all be done virtually. So again, it's going to be important. So I'm going to leave you with, do I think it's good or bad for economic development? What are the pros and cons? The pros, increase the size of your skilled workforce. You also can increase tax from remote working residents. You can take a look at a reduction in pollution. You can take a look at improved labour market participation with people with disabilities, older workers. People can work where they are, and more flexibility, and increased startups. The cons are you'll all have seen it. It's difficulty in providing training and skills development. It's also hard when you hire a new staff member to induct them into the company, and having a culture is tough. Mental health, a lot of people are struggling with not knowing when to switch off, being non-stop on Zoom calls. It's leading to an increase in house prices, loss of potential corporate tax, and demand for the office space which you already have built up. So there are pros and cons to this, but this is where we're seeing the market, and a lot of people are building value propositions to attract talent. And I said this to Mark yesterday. One of my thoughts is, this time next year, you'll be going to less trade shows, and you'll probably add going to more, like university career fairs in different countries with a list of possible jobs that can be done remotely. So you'll be looking to get talent. So it's just something to think about. So I'm going to pass again back to Mark. You're on mute again.
Here I am again. That's fantastic stuff. I can't say enough how much better you are at presenting your slides than I was at presenting your slides. So I'm happy to hear it. Chris, do you have 10 minutes after this? Do you have until 10 minutes after the webinar free? Okay, I'm going to go through the rest of this quickly, guys, because you care about workforce. I want to share some data with you. This is all MZ data, but I want time for Q&A. So I'm going to go through this faster than I'd like to, but I know people want to ask questions. So this will all be available to you. You're going to get to see this MZ data. I think it's amazing stuff, but it's going to make you think about, I need to be focusing on workforce attraction, like Chris said, because the workforce is shrinking. It's getting smaller. And as I'm doing my job creating jobs, Well, are there any people to work those jobs? So this is all MZ data. None of it is my opinion. So 10.9 million job openings. This number has changed. This is 2 months old, or from September, presented in October. So not that old, but before COVID, there were only 7 million job openings. However, the labor force participation rate is at the lowest it's been since we started recording it recently. So there's not a high labor force participation rate, yet there's more jobs open than there's ever been. So I'm doing a great job, pat myself on the back for creating jobs, but if there's not people to work them, then what's the point? Well, where are these people, right? Like, what happened to all the people? And that is a multi-part answer, which the first part I want to point out, a lot of these people took opportunities, took some extra money from the government that they didn't have before, and they started their own businesses. They carpe diem, they seized their own future, they seized the day. And those people are running their own businesses, so they're not necessarily coming back. Matter of fact, I hope they don't come back to work those regular jobs, because that would mean their businesses didn't make it. They started on their own. Another places, the baby boomers said goodbye. And when we think of baby boomers, we're like, okay, the 75-year-old person, like, sure, they were ready to leave the workforce anyway. But what the problem is that a 55-year-old right now is also a baby boomer, and they chose to leave the labor force. And if you see on this scale here, that 2 million more of them than predicted left the labor force last year. So 3.2 million left when it was only assumed about 1.2 million would leave. 2 million people in a 40 million person labor force disappear. That's a big deal. So they're gone. And as you can see here, they're probably not coming back. You can see it obviously dipped with the pandemic. The interesting thing I see is when businesses started opening back up, these folks came back to the workforce, but then they said, you know what? Nope, I'm going to go ahead and retire. I was right when I thought that this was a good opportunity to leave. And it has not rebounded at all in the last year. That labor force is not coming back. We cannot count on them. So let's talk about the people under that age. So the people from 18 to 55. Who are they and what's happening to them? We are relying on millennials to be our saviors. And millennials listen to songs by Blink-182 that featured a line saying, "Work sucks, I know." I don't know how much we're going to get them to participate. And we can look at data. What is their participation rate at? And that you can see that a lot of this working class age folks use the pandemic as just an excuse to back off the labor force. You see that it dipped, but in the last year, it has not grown at all. The folks younger than 55 that we need coming back to jobs, it has not rebounded and it has stayed stagnant. It's a trend worth paying attention to. Where did they go? Well, I saw this as a real life headline. Mom of 4 ditches job to be a dumpster diver, earning $1,000 a week. Apparently, there are a lot of ways that are creative to make money. I say this in jest, even though it's real. There's a lot of ways to find making money, not just dumpster diving, but TikTok, Instagram, Twitch. If you've ever heard of that, it's where people play video games and people watch them play video games and pay them money to do it. Happens on YouTube. So a lot of folks are finding unique ways of making money. What else? Well, it's not just millennials, and it's not at anything to do with the pandemic. You can see from this scale that this number has dropped since 1990. You see it has been trending downward for the last 30 years. The pandemic, it kind of went down obviously quickly, but if you drew a straight line through, you would see that this is pretty much where it was expected to be by now, even without the pandemic. It's a trend worth paying attention to. So why can they do that? Well, quite honestly, that there's been data to show a lot of them have accepted, I'm going to live with my boomer parent. I'm going to live in their basement and I don't have to make a lot of money. The second thing is people are getting married later, so there's not a significant other to take care of. They're having less children, so there's not more responsibilities. It's something that's just been a trend happening, and I don't know there's anything we can do about it. The last thing is we're not having babies. We have not replaced the rate at the rate we needed to have babies since the mid 70s. You see here that 2.1 people per family need to have 2.1 babies per family. We have been below that number since the mid 70s. It's not replacing these group of people that we're going to be needing to replace jobs for, that were the baby boomers. And it's a trend that's only continuing downward. It's lower than it's ever been right now at 1.73. You can see that 10 years ago, there were some states who were still ahead of that curve. Now there are none. You can see that it's not just a United States issue. It's also a world issue. You can see most countries are below that rate that's going to replace the people who are no longer with us. There's going to be less labor force. You need to be prepared for that. So what should you do? Well, one thing that I saw on a headline here is, well, refugees used to actually be a big part of our workforce, but in the last year, we let in less in the United States, speaking, than we ever have before, just 11,400 people. The only time it was, or the number 2 least year amount of refugees let in was 11,800 in 2020. So you say, okay, what is the normal amount that we would let in that would become good parts of the workforce? Well, you can see that in 2016, it was almost 100,000 people let in. In the 4 years since then, this has got nothing to do with politics. This has everything to do with, this was a part of the labor force that did exist that now no longer does. We haven't even let 100,000 people in since 2016. It's not workers that we can count on unless we change some policies that are going to get those folks back to us. So immigration policies need to be improved to bring in more labor. It's not that farce of, well, they're taking all of our jobs. We need jobs taken, and that's a good workforce. Second, automation. It's a good thing. Some jobs that don't need to exist can be taken by robots, and that's not so bad. It's a good thing. And then lastly, this just speaks to what Chris was talking about, quite frankly. Here are the areas that there are percentages of people going up in terms of the working age population. So go to the blue areas and recruit people from those areas, because those are the future labor force. So when you're deciding, instead of putting an ad to talk about your community and how good it is for a business, talk about how good your community is to come live in, because we need those people there. But to further that, you need to make your community somewhere people want to live, because they have a choice right now. I get to go wherever I want to go. I don't have to go anywhere. Let's make sure that we have a vibrant small business community, that we have parks, that we have dog parks, that we have walking paths, biking paths, stuff that a younger group of people, what's important to them, because they're not coming simply because there's a job available. There are jobs available everywhere. You need to make your community attractive. The last thing I want to touch on before we go into Q&A, which we don't need in conclusion, is I forgot a BRNE story about an economic developer that asked their top employer in town, what can I do to be helping you? It was a noble thing to ask. How can I be helping you? And an actual answer to that question from this top employer was, you could stop recruiting new businesses because they're taking all of my labor and it's making me have to be more competitive. It's something worth thinking about. Is that happening in your community? Is there a tight labor market? Do I need to be helping the businesses already there just as much as I'm helping bringing in new ones? So that is everything that I have to say. This is me, Mark Hayes of SizeUp, and my email. That is Chris Knight from WAVTEQ and his email. I say we take on some questions now. We're at that point. We're going to let this thing go until 10 minutes after the hour. So please feel free to ask questions. Chris, if you happen to see any already that you wanted to take on, you can go ahead and read that, or I can read it for us, quite honestly.
What I've tried to do is kind of group some of the questions thematically.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I'm going to start with the first question to Chris, which is, Mark mentioned that most economic developers focus on job creation. Chris, you said the FDI will be, a lot will be mergers and acquisition, but M&A doesn't necessarily mean job creation. M&A could lead to efficiencies that cause job elimination. Does this mean that the vast majority of FDI, which is M&A, will not necessarily create any net new jobs?
Well, it's a good question. I think, M&A can be seen as either. If the economic development organization is involved in the acquisition, usually that means there's going to be jobs at it. There's a future plan to it. But if it's more of an aggressive acquisition, then they can consolidate. So it could definitely lose jobs. It really, it will depend on each test case. And I know in the US, I know in Germany, UK, that M&A is getting a bit more difficult. It's entering these markets. The UK, you used to be able to buy anything if it wasn't bolted down, but now I think there's due diligence being put on, and they're trying to find out what the intentions are within the company. So I do think that M&A will help in some cases with job creation, but it's not to be sure. And then you also have a huge number of EDOs do not get involved in M&A work at all. So this is stuff that's happening that they might not know about, and so have no involvement.
Thanks. That's great and insightful. Next question from our audience to Mark is: we have so many small businesses, but only a few economic development staff. How can we serve so many businesses?
Yeah, it'd be difficult and impossible to do without an unlimited amount of people resources to help those businesses. The answers, I mean, what I pointed out, quite honestly, you have to be using software. It's not a matter of, I wish I could invest in software solutions, but we can't because, I only have so much budget. I get budget's an issue, but it's a lot cheaper to invest in software than even just to get an additional staff person. So across the board in economic development, you really should be having software help you do your job. Small businesses are all really unique. It would be unfair to ask you to be an expert in each small business issue. But what I notice a lot of people saying is somebody else already does this in our community. Our Chamber of Commerce does this. Well, I would question you to say, do they? Question that. Does the Chamber of Commerce help a startup start? Because in my experience, they help a small business who already exists that is already a member of their organization. How does that help the entrepreneur? How does that help the startup make a better decision? So I would question, are those folks helping? And what can I do to be helping those people? Which my answer to your question, or to that person's question, is software solutions. You have to make sure that you're investing in tools that people can use. Your website in general.
Next question from the audience is for you, Chris. Why is climate change causing foreign direct investment?
Well, there's a few things. Climate change isn't just affecting foreign direct investment. It's affecting everyone's decisions and what they're doing, and they're looking, how to make it a better world we live in. And they're not going to, these companies who have got these beliefs, they've got these their ESG, their corporate responsibility, their CSRs. They're not going to invest in locations which are not fighting against climate change. So it's more that it's on their mind. Then on top of that, you've got, if you listen to your president and stuff, it sounds like there's going to be a lot more incentives towards doing this type of thing. And companies, if they're doing renewable energy in the US, I imagine there's going to be quite strong incentives for that. There has been over the years in Germany, Spain, the UK. So I think that will grow it. But the main thing that's changing is actually people's minds and how they operate. And then you've got, the sustainable development goals people are trying to reach. We do, as an example, when we're doing our lead generation, we have to run companies through like some of our internal scoring system to see, are they going to be ethical? Are they going to help locations hit their sustainable development goals? So climate change is just another aspect of this, and it is front and center of everyone's minds right now. So, I think it's going to come up more. I think you're going to have more questions as economic development organizations about, going to be carbon neutral, about, the use of renewable energy, and all of this will start coming up as people make those decisions. And I think, one thing that does help, as I said, is remote working. It's worth thinking about because you do travel less, and then people will also, I believe, think more about traveling, just in general to visit a site when a lot of this can be done virtually, or traveling to meet with you when they can get a lot of data and a lot of information from your website or from what you send them. The pandemic will also make people more averse to traveling. They might, question a little more about just jumping on a flight. And I tell you, I mentioned to you before, so 2019, I did 130 flights a year. I have still yet to do one business trip since February 2020. So, and business has grown. We've grown 25%. And I guess we're not going to be the only sort of business doing that.
Thanks so much, Chris. Mark, next question from the audience. You showed examples of SizeUp being used by Texas cities. Can it be implemented in other US states? What other states or cities is it implemented?
Yeah. I forgot that when I put that slide together, it was for the Texas Economic Development Corporation. So obvious examples. But yeah, we're throughout the country. SizeUp can be implemented anywhere in the United States. Worth mentioning, if you are from another country, definitely reach out. It's not that it's impossible, but right now, I would say if you are in the United States, we probably have somebody near you who has invested in SizeUp. The size of community doesn't matter. So, anywhere from Tulsa to rural parts of Kentucky to, Central California, Stockton, Bakersfield, to Sacramento, like it doesn't matter, quite frankly. Whatever size you are, we're going to have data for you, and it's going to be relevant to the businesses in your community.
Thanks, Mark. Chris, next question from the audience. How different are economic development strategies globally? The US isn't having a job creation problem. There are 11 million unfilled jobs. Is job creation in the USA just exacerbating the problem that businesses have of too much competition to hire employees?
Wow, where do I begin? Looking at the world and then talking about the US. I think with FDI, and I'm only talking about FDI, not general job creation. With FDI, the goal should be to be creating jobs that you want in your community, that you have got the skill set and the talent. You shouldn't just be saying, I just want any jobs to come to my community. This should all be a well thought out strategy to think, this is the idea between you being strategic or you being reactive. Being strategic means you're going to identify where you see your community going. What are these growth sectors you see? What's the talent you see coming through? And then you're going to identify companies to fit with that. And you'll be growing that way. With current population or unemployment, I guess it's all about seeing what the skill sets are and seeing what you need to bring in for them to work in, or reskilling people to take on different tasks. I'm not completely sure of what unemployment's like in different, or employment is like in some of the different states, different regions, but it would be worth taking a look at that and looking what the sectors trying to attract are and seeing if there's any, reskilling that can be done.
Right. And what you spoke of earlier, Chris, if you don't have any labor, then maybe your focus needs to be on attracting labor, just like you were talking about in Tulsa or Tacoma or Topeka. Like, I saw a commercial yesterday, Alaska. They're trying to recruit me to move to Alaska. It's way too cold up there. But so maybe your focus should be on bringing in people if you don't have any people to work those jobs.
Well, a lot of foreign companies, if you take a look at India, for instance, a lot of Indian companies start up in tech with just one or two jobs, and they send their own people to begin with, and then they will grow from that. So different are different, but you've also got, I believe, you can go remote working route, but you might also want to upskill what your current workforce are doing. And I use Ireland as a really good example. And when I was growing up, it was the Celtic Tiger years. Ireland was where people went to manufacture in Europe, so it's low cost. Then it suddenly became higher cost and doing better, so it moved up to being R&D. And it's just kept evolving Ireland to be, they've moved up the value chain, and Singapore did exactly the same. And this is what the most successful communities and countries at FDI do. Even though, the reason they use Ireland is you only have a population of 4 million people, but yet they're still evolving, they're still moving up, which means the GDP per capita increases in Ireland pretty regularly. And so everyone's living standards improve. So if you can go for, you mentioned it earlier, Mark, if you want to attract people to your community, you need to think outside of FDI. You need to be thinking about your restaurants, your social scene. A good example I mentioned to Mark yesterday is we work for Dubai and the airport free zone, and it's got every type of company within logistics and all of that. But they found that everyone left that area to go and live, to go and spend, to go and eat. So they're just going to build another city on top of that city, which has got everything you talked about earlier: running tracks, themes, music theaters, restaurants, retail, because they want everyone to stay in the same area to spend their money, and then they can attract more people. And it's going to be fascinating. They only announced it 2 months ago, and they'll have it done by 2023.
Man, yeah, community development and economic development are just starting to merge.
Absolutely. Final question, which will actually go to both of you, is do you think the pandemic has created a long-term cultural and professional change that will cause economic developers to do their work differently?
I believe it has caused change that should help economic developers do their job differently. Will it is to be seen. It has for a lot of people. But yeah, I mean, how could economic development be different than literally every other facet of life? Things have changed. That's a very complex question. But my answer is yes, that it will.
Absolutely. I think it has to, it's no way in my opinion that we're going back to how things were, where people just traveled to trade shows. They didn't look at the ROI of them. I think people will be doing hybrids in many ways. Some of the things I reckon will change is, one, it will be a mixture of doing webinars, virtual events, and going to in-person events. You'll only go to maybe 3-4 a year. Two, your website will stop being reactive and you'll use it as a business development tool. You'll be really caring more about what people do on your website, not just having a website. Three, I think social media will be used much better, again, more proactively. I think having having a CRM up to date, having all your contact information, all of this, I think you'll be doing more learning, distant learning. I think it might not be out there just yet, but there's going to be some, digital facilitation for companies who are setting up in your community, because everything is going to be moving digitally. And, you either embrace it or you're going back to what you did, but I don't think other people are going back. So you might have less budget and trying to do the same things as you did before, and it just doesn't fit. So, if you think of yourself, anyone here on this call, think of going to a trade show versus a virtual event. You say, okay, it's 3 days. It's a day traveling each side of that. There's then the emails to get caught up with. There's then being tired every night, so you don't check your emails those days. A virtual event, you're there, and then you switch off and you do your actual job. So I think there's no way around that. There's going to be hybrid events moving forward. Just thanks everyone, and looking forward to being allowed back in your country very soon. Well, I'm allowed now, so just waiting on an invite now.
We look forward to having you. Thank you, everybody, and we'll conclude it there.